In January 1942, the Soviet winter counteroffensive at Moscow had driven German forces back across a broad front. The Wehrmacht retreated between 100 and 280 kilometers from the Soviet capital, reeling from its first major defeat of the war. Yet the withdrawal remained incomplete. Northwest of Moscow, German forces clung to a massive territorial bulge centered on the city of Rzhev, a salient jutting eastward into Soviet-held territory, extending 160 kilometers from the capital. Field Marshal Zhukov would characterize the threat with stark precision. The German forces at Rzhev represented a dagger pointed at Moscow. The bulge stretched roughly 200 kilometers wide and protruded 160 kilometers into Soviet lines, a geographic anomaly that created both opportunity and vulnerability for both sides. For the Wehrmacht, the Rzhev Salient offered forward staging areas for a renewed offensive toward Moscow once German forces recovered from their winter setbacks. The elevated terrain around Rzhev dominated the surrounding landscape, offering observation posts and defensive strongpoints. For the Soviets, the bulge represented an unacceptable threat. German forces remained within striking distance of Moscow, positioned to exploit any weakening of Soviet defenses. The salient's existence demonstrated the incompleteness of the winter victory and provided the Wehrmacht with fortified positions from which to launch spoiling attacks. The bulge also bisected critical rail lines connecting Moscow with the northwestern regions, complicating supply and reinforcement operations. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. On 12 January 1942, the German High Command appointed General Walter Model to command the 9th Army. Model's reputation as a defensive specialist preceded him. His task: stabilize the salient's perimeter, transform temporary positions into fortified lines, and preserve the Wehrmacht's forward presence. The Rzhev salient would anchor German positions in the central sector for the next 14 months, consuming armies and reshaping the Eastern Front's strategic calculus. Model stepped from his staff car into the headquarters of Germany's 9th Army, inheriting one of the Wehrmacht's most precarious positions. The exposed wedge stretched across 90 kilometers of frozen terrain where temperatures plunged below -30 Celsius. Soviet forces from the Kalinin Front, specifically the 39th and 29th Armies, maintained relentless pressure against the German perimeter. The protrusion's boundaries remained fluid rather than fortified, with units fighting to maintain cohesion against attacks that threatened to collapse the entire position. Model's first actions reflected his methodical nature. He demanded detailed reports from divisional commanders, studied topographical maps identifying defensible terrain, and assessed the combat strength of formations battered by weeks of continuous winter warfare. The reality Model observed contradicted the clean lines drawn on operational maps. German infantry divisions, depleted to 50% strength, held sectors designed for fully equipped formations. Supply lines stretched across partisan-infested territory where winter storms regularly severed road connections. Artillery ammunition stocks ran critically low, limiting counter-battery capabilities against Soviet gun positions that systematically targeted German strongpoints. Model's defensive doctrine emphasized economy of force, identifying which terrain must be held absolutely and which could be surrendered to preserve combat power. He ordered immediate reconnaissance of fallback positions, established mobile reserves from reconstituted units, and began transforming the chaotic perimeter into a coherent defensive system. The German position would not merely absorb Soviet attacks, it would channel them into killing zones where concentrated firepower offset numerical disadvantage. Through February 1942, Soviet commanders studied the German salient, identifying vulnerabilities in the hastily drawn perimeter. Intelligence indicated German positions remained incomplete, with gaps between strongpoints and limited tactical reserves. Stalin's Stavka Directive authorized offensive operations to collapse the salient before spring thaw, rendered operations impossible. On March 3, 1942, Soviet artillery opened preparatory bombardments across multiple sectors of the Rzhev perimeter. The 39th Army launched its main effort from positions northeast of the Salient, driving toward Sychevka to sever German lateral communications. Infantry divisions advanced through snow-choked forests, attempting to infiltrate between German strongpoints rather than assault them directly. The 29th Army simultaneously attacked from the east, aiming to penetrate the Salient's base. German defenders occupied fortified villages converted into all-around defense positions. Each strongpoint contained entrenched infantry, registered artillery support, and pre-sighted machine gun fields of fire covering approach routes. The defensive system relied on mutual support between positions separated by 2 to 4 kilometers, with mobile battle groups positioned to counterattack penetrations. When Soviet infantry bypassed strongpoints, German garrisons maintained their positions, interdicting supply lines and preventing exploitation. The 39th Army achieved initial penetrations of 15 to 20 kilometers. Though advancing through the gaps, Model's forces had not yet closed. Soviet rifle divisions pushed forward without securing their flanks, creating vulnerable supply corridors through German-held terrain. The 9th Army's response followed Model's defensive doctrine, contained penetrations at their base, maintained strongpoint garrisons, and massed reserves for counterstrokes against exposed Soviet spearheads. By late March, the 39th Army found itself in a precarious salient within the German salient, surrounded on 3 sides with a narrow supply corridor under constant interdiction. German counterattacks severed Soviet communications repeatedly, forcing resupply by airdrops. By April 20th, offensive operations concluded with the 39th Army still encircled, the salient intact, and Soviet casualties mounting without strategic gain. In early summer 1942, with the ground firm and maneuver possible, Model shifted to offense. The trapped force, comprising the remnants of the Soviet 39th Army and 11th Cavalry Corps, occupied a shrinking enclave deep within German-controlled territory, sustained only by sporadic aerial resupply. Interdiction fires from surrounding German positions already strangled ground movement between isolated Soviet strongholds. The German plan concentrated 6 divisions against the pocket's perimeter, creating overwhelming local superiority. Model's operational method emphasized deliberate preparation over hasty assault. Artillery registered on known Soviet fortified villages, assault groups rehearsed for close combat in wooded terrain, supply stockpiles positioned forward. Operation Seydlitz commenced on July 2, 1942. German infantry divisions advanced from multiple axes, their artillery preparation targeting Soviet command posts and ammunition depots identified through signal intelligence. The trapped force fought with desperate intensity, knowing encirclement offered no withdrawal routes. Fortified villages changed hands repeatedly as Soviet commanders committed their dwindling reserves to hold critical terrain. German assault guns reduced defensive positions methodically, while infantry battled through heavily wooded sectors where artillery proved less effective. By 13 July, 11 days of sustained combat reduced the pocket to isolated strongpoints. Soviet ammunition stocks exhausted, communications collapsed, and casualty rates climbed beyond sustainable levels. The encircled formations disintegrated as organized units. The remnants emerged from the forests northwest of Rzhev. These survivors, moving in groups of 10 to 50 men, slipped through gaps in the German cordon during the night. They reached Red Army positions carrying wounded on improvised stretchers, their uniforms torn by barbed wire and undergrowth. The trapped garrison had ceased to exist as an organized formation. The Kalinin Front's losses exceeded 100,000 men. 2 armies had been destroyed as combat formations. Yet Zubtsov fell to Red Army counterattacks on the same day the pocket collapsed, demonstrating that Kalinin Front retained offensive capability despite catastrophic losses. The salient persisted, its perimeter defended by entrenched German forces who had demonstrated their ability to execute complex offensive operations while maintaining defensive positions across a 200-kilometer front. At 6:30 on July 30th, 1942, the Soviet Kalinin Front's artillery opened fire across the northern approaches to the Rzhev position. For 90 minutes, massed batteries pounded German defensive lines. 152mm gun howitzers, hammering concrete bunkers and communication trenches while lighter field guns worked over forward positions. Behind this curtain of steel, the 30th Army's mobile group prepared to advance. 9 tank brigades, organized specifically for this offensive, assembled in their jumping-off positions. Each brigade carried T-34/76 medium tanks as their primary striking force, vehicles capable of 34 miles per hour cross-country speed, but vulnerable to high-velocity anti-tank guns, now standard in German defensive networks. The plan called for deep penetration toward Rzhev itself, 17 kilometers to the south. At 8 o'clock, the tank brigades rolled forward through the morning haze, accompanied by rifle divisions tasked with securing captured ground. The 30th Army struck directly at positions held by the German 256th Infantry Division. The German response exposed immediate friction in the Soviet plan. Model's 9th Army had spent weeks strengthening its defensive network across the bulge. Anti-tank guns positioned in depth, not just along the forward line, began engaging Soviet armor at ranges where the T-34's 76mm gun struggled to suppress them effectively. German artillery pre-registered on likely approach routes or dropped concentrations on assembling Soviet infantry. By midday, Soviet tank units had penetrated the first German defensive belt, but at significant cost. Burning T-34s marked the advance routes. Infantry support, moving on foot through defended ground, lagged behind the armor. Dawn broke on 31st July. At 5:15, a 30-minute barrage targeted German command posts, ammunition dumps, and reserve assembly areas. The T-34 mediums advanced in company columns, exploiting penetration corridors opened the previous day. The breakthrough occurred not as dramatic collapse, but as systemic failure. By 10:30, 3 battalion commanders within 256th Infantry Division reported loss of contact with adjacent units. Strong points designed for mutual support found themselves isolated. A regiment fractured into 9 separate defensive positions, each fighting independently. By 1300, the first German defensive line no longer existed as a continuous belt. Soviet reconnaissance units reported open terrain ahead. The path to Rzhev's northern approaches stood open. General Zhukov arrived at Western Front headquarters to assume direct command of a renewed offensive. 2 Soviet armies, 20th and 31st, stood ready for coordinated assault. The objective lay 30 kilometers west. Rzhev-Sychevka, a critical rail junction feeding German forces in the Salient. Severing this line would isolate 3 German divisions. The offensive began before dawn on August 4th. Soviet forces advanced 6 kilometers by nightfall, reaching the Vazuza River's eastern approaches. These casualties mounted in prepared killing zones. German machine gun nests and pre-registered mortar concentrations extracted predictable tolls. Soviet rifle divisions lost 20% strength in the opening assault. By August 5th, lead elements forced crossings. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges under sporadic artillery fire. A bridgehead formed on the western bank, 3 kilometers wide and 2 deep. Soviet riflemen dug fighting positions in the sandy soil, while follow-on units crossed throughout the night. At first light on the 7th of August, Soviet armor columns rolled westward from the Vazuza lodgment. T-34 mediums and KV-1 heavy tanks advanced in staggered echelons. By midday, lead tank battalions reached the rail line. Reconnaissance elements reported locomotive movements along the tracks, supply trains hauling ammunition, rations, and replacement personnel. The breakthrough had achieved its tactical objective. The 352,867 Axis troops holding the Rzhev sector depended on uninterrupted rail access for survival. German response arrived in the form of the 6th Panzer Division. The armored relief force deployed into blocking positions with Panzer IV AUSF. G tanks, equipped with the long 75mm L/48 gun. Supporting elements emplaced 8.8cm flak guns in anti-tank roles. The dual-purpose weapons capable of firing 15 to 20 rounds per minute at ranges exceeding 14 kilometers. Walter Model arrived at headquarters on August 8th, returning from convalescent leave to find Soviet armor astride the rail line, the deepest Soviet penetration of the campaign. His immediate assessment focused on the junction where Soviet tanks now interdicted German logistics. Model's first orders restructured the improvised response into coherent defense. He directed elements of 1st, 2nd, and 5th Panzer divisions to converge on coordinates flanking the penetration for a coordinated counterattack. At 03:47 hours on the 9th of August, German tank commanders initiated cold start procedures. Panzer IV crews hand-cranked inertia starters in the pre-dawn darkness. Each vehicle carried 39 rounds of 75mm ammunition, loaded specifically for penetration against T-34 frontal armor. Model had positioned his mechanized reserves along the railway embankment itself, terrain providing cover for hull-down deployment. At 05:21 hours, with sufficient ambient light for optical range finding, 73 Panzers advanced in company-strength formations. The 75mm guns engaged at maximum effective range. The muzzle velocity of 990 meters per second allowed armor-piercing rounds to defeat T-34 Glacis plates at distances the Soviet 76.2mm gun could not reciprocate. Soviet tankers responded with immediate counterfire. The engagement devolved into direct fire exchange at progressively closing ranges. German 8.8cm flak batteries, repositioned overnight, provided overwatch from elevated positions, the 88mm projectiles punching through T-34 turret rings and hull sponsons. By 08:47 hours, both formations had sustained catastrophic losses. 17 German panzers burned along the forward slope. Soviet casualties included 23 T-34s and 11 Kf-1s, heavy tanks destroyed within visual range of the rails. The counterattack achieved tactical disruption but exhausted Model's armored reserve. Neither force possessed sufficient strength to exploit success. The iron lifeline remained contested. 31 destroyed vehicles per linear kilometer of front. Soviet infantry pivoted from the stalled armored engagement and advanced into Rzhev's suburban periphery. The transition was immediate, from open fields littered with burned-out hulls to residential blocks where German defenders had prepared interlocking fields of fire. Trenches connected reinforced basements. Machine gun nests occupied second-story windows with clear sightlines down approach streets. The 256th Infantry Division had transformed the outskirts into a defensive matrix designed to bleed attacking formations through measured attrition. The fighting from 10 to 30 August bore no resemblance to mobile tank warfare. Soviet infantry advanced building by building, or often supported by direct-fire artillery pieces wheeled into point-blank range. German 88mm flak guns pivoted to horizontal trajectories, firing high-explosive rounds through masonry walls at 15 to 20 rounds per minute. Engagement distances collapsed from kilometers to meters, sometimes to the thickness of a single wall. Alexander Karp, a Soviet soldier enduring this phase, described existence reduced to subterranean survival. "We live like moles in the earth. The walls are made of planks. It's just a bit uncomfortable when there is a lot of noise." On 21st August, after 11 days of continuous pressure, the 30th Army captured the first trench line in Rzhev's suburbs. The only territorial success in a 3-week period defined by casualties rather than maneuver. By 23rd August, the first Rzhev-Sychevka offensive officially concluded. Soviet irrecoverable losses reached 57,968 men. The bulge remained intact. Zhukov transferred south to the developing crisis at Stalingrad. Ivan Konev assumed control of the Rzhev sector, inheriting a battle that had devolved into positional warfare reminiscent of the previous war's Western Front. Konev renewed operations with focus on Rzhev proper. On September 21st, elements of the 215th Rifle Division entered the town's streets. House-to-house fighting commenced immediately. German infantry, positioned in reinforced buildings and supported by pre-registered artillery, contested every intersection. The PTRS anti-tank rifles distributed among Soviet rifle companies proved effective against German half-tracks in the close urban terrain. Their 14.5mm rounds penetrating 30 to 40 millimeters of armor at point-blank range. The street fighting continued for 9 days. KV-1E heavy tanks provided direct fire support, though their 52.5-ton weight-limited maneuverability in rubble-choked streets. German 88mm guns engaged the heavy tanks at ranges where their armor advantage diminished. On September 30th, fighting ceased. The 215th Rifle Division's penetration had failed to dislodge German defenders. Model's Salient remained intact, the town and its rail connections still firmly in Wehrmacht hands. The second major Soviet offensive ended in German defensive victory. In late October, staff officers drafted Operation Mars. The September offensive had deployed 334,808 men and 412 tanks. This new operation would dwarf that effort, and planning documents detailed an assault force of 817,000 men and 2,352 tanks, the largest concentration yet committed to eliminating Model's Salient. On November 25th, the offensive launched. Artillery preparation began at 0730 hours. Concentration fires targeting known German strongpoints along the Büffel approaches. At 0845, lead battalions advanced through frozen marshland. Il-2M3, Sturmovik ground attack aircraft swept low over advancing columns, their 23mm cannon fire suppressing German observation posts. Model's reserves struck Soviet spearheads within hours. He had positioned multiple Kampfgruppen behind the front line, screening routes toward critical road junctions. When reconnaissance reported Soviet armor moving through the marshland approaches, German counterattack formations rolled forward, supported by artillery concentrations that transformed frozen creekbeds into kill zones. The collisions shattered Soviet momentum. KV-1E heavy tanks found their 52.5-ton mass a liability on ground, offering no firm roads. Panzer IVs engaged from hull-down positions along ridgelines, forcing heavier Soviet machines into exposed approaches where concealed anti-tank guns targeted track assemblies. By the 11th of December, the assault had consumed 16 days and achieved only localized penetrations. The 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, encircled deep in German territory, ordered a breakout attempt as ammunition stocks depleted. The 33rd Army launched a relief effort, throwing rifle divisions toward the trapped cavalry. But Model's counterattack groups had sealed the penetration routes. On December 20th, Moscow acknowledged reality. Operation Mars officially concluded. The assault had cost 100,000 Soviet dead and 1,700 tanks destroyed, losses representing more than double the armor committed to the initial assault. The Rzhev salient remained in German hands, its defenses intact, Model's 9th Army unbroken. In late February 1943, German staff officers gathered around situation maps, their focus no longer on holding the Rzhev projection, but on abandoning it entirely. The bulge that consumed men and materiel for 16 months had become a liability in a transformed strategic landscape. Operation Mars cost the Soviets 100,000, killed by 20th of December, yet the defensive victory yielded no operational advantage. The 6th Army's destruction at Stalingrad eliminated 30 divisions. Soviet offensives threatened to unhinge the entire southern front. But the salient now represented something more valuable than terrain. It tied down 17 German divisions that could decide battles elsewhere. The planning for Operation Büffel reflected this calculus. Abandoning the westward extension released enough combat power to constitute a substantial mobile reserve for the planned summer offensive near Kursk. By early March, the withdrawal commenced. German units disengaged from positions they fortified through 2 winters, abandoning trenches where they repelled attacks by 817,000 Soviet troops. Engineers prepared demolitions for bridges, rail lines, and infrastructure. Combat formations established successive defensive lines to screen the evacuation. On March 31st, Red Army units reoccupied Rzhev's ruins, entering a town devastated by 20 months of occupation and combat. The Germans designated this advance the Soviet Third Rzhev-Sychevka offensive, though it encountered minimal resistance. The riflemen advanced through streets reduced to corridors of rubble. Every building bore marks of systematic demolition. Wehrmacht engineers had blown facades off structures that artillery had already gutted. The city center, once home to 56,000 residents, contained no intact structures. Scorched walls marked where German forces had burned what they could not carry. Scouts found only stone pilings where bridges once stood. Every water main had been destroyed. The electrical system existed only as torn cables. The rail station, the strategic objective that anchored German defense for 20 months, consisted of nothing but foundation stones and scattered track sections. The soldiers encountered no civilians. The German occupation had either evacuated or killed Rzhev's population. Cellars that might have sheltered residents contained only debris. The liberators found a necropolis, not a city. Across 14 months of continuous combat, from January 1942 through March 1943, the Rzhev salient consumed armies whole. German casualties, 670,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. Soviet losses, 1,100,000 men. Combined, more than 1.7 million soldiers fell in a sector barely 60 miles wide. The arithmetic of attrition carved through unit rosters with mechanical efficiency. Wehrmacht battalions that entered the salient at 500 men exited at 13. Entire divisions required complete reconstitution. Soviet rifle divisions, thrown against prepared German defensive positions, disintegrated in days. In Operation Mars alone consumed 100,000 dead and 1,700 tanks in 25 days. The 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, encircled during the fighting, required a desperate breakout attempt. Most did not escape. The Germans held through autumn Rasputitsa, winter blizzards, and spring thaw. Their defensive victory came at catastrophic cost. By early 1943, the Wehrmacht High Command faced a brutal calculation. The Rzhev salient tied down reserves needed for summer operations further south. On 31st March 1943, Soviet forces reoccupied Rzhev without resistance. The city no longer existed. 14 months of artillery bombardment, airstrikes, and urban combat had reduced it to geological strata, foundations, rubble, ash. The salient that consumed 1.7 million casualties had served neither side's strategic objectives. German defenders withdrew to prepared positions. Soviet forces occupied a wasteland, offering no operational advantage. The dagger that pointed at Moscow for 14 months had been removed not by Soviet assault, but by German calculation, leaving only ruins and the ghosts of armies that fought for ground now rendered worthless. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.